Right, good morning everybody and welcome back. I hope festivities were continued after our rather nice dinner up here last evening. We are going to have a look this morning at in a general theme of kind of sorting out problems that we've got. We're going to have a look at agent-based modelling of economic crises, and we're in the very capable hands of Paul Ormerod for that topic this morning. Having written books by titles such as The Death of Economics and Why Most Things Fail, I don't know whether Paul would classify himself as the Economist's favourite economist or perhaps not. But perhaps one of his lesser-known claims to fame is that he has bagged the Munros. Would you like to explain what that is, Paul?
There's got a list of Scottish hills over 3,000 feet.
And only some few hundred people have actually done that.
Yeah. Well, let's not go into the subtleties of the.
Okay. So that's doubtless where he gets all his energy for writing these books. So I think it should be for an interesting and entertaining morning this morning.
Well, thanks very much. Actually, I spoke at the Department of Community and Local Government just before early December, and I'd given a talk there. Kim mentioned Death of Economics. I'd given a talk there about 5 years ago, and 15 people had turned up, and this time it's 120. They're standing room only, and this was the actual introduction that the chief economist made. He stood up and said, well, we're very pleased to have Paul here today. When he wrote The Death of Economics 15 years ago, we all thought he was a complete lunatic. But now, and that was it. So anyway, and I'm just going to stand slightly to one side, because if you go here, it's like being under interrogation from the searchlights. But the most important thing to say is that modelling what economists call the business cycle, in the ups and downs of as the economy goes into recession, pulls out again. I mean, it's a very, very hard problem. It's not a trivial one at all. The fact that lots and lots of models will generate fluctuations, but it's safe to say that despite 200 years of effort, there is still no satisfactory theory, completely satisfactory theory of the business cycle. So it's an extremely hard problem. Is the most important thing to mention about that. So economists call the fluctuations in annual output, or GDP, gross domestic product as it's referred to. I'm going to use the terms interchangeably, so when I say GDP, I mean the overall amount of output in the economy. It's called a business cycle, but what does it look like over time? What are the problems we've got? What is it we're trying to understand? And I've just got here time series for annual percentage change in the American economy. The other economies are qualitatively very similar. From 1871, when we can plausibly regard it as an industrialised economy, its agricultural sector had been shrinking quite dramatically. It's a modernised economy by then. That's not an agricultural one. To 2009. And economists define a recession, a conventional definition of a recession. If I can get the red button to work, which I was doing before.
At the front.
At the front. This one. This one. This one. Brilliant. Is when, I mean, this is annual data. I mean, more recently, over this period here, we've got quarterly data, but now, for most of the part, it's just annual estimates that we've got. And define a recession as a year in which output growth is below zero. That's just a conventional definition used. I mean, just on that, I mean, if output growth is, no, this scale's wrong actually, but leaving that aside, the zero line is correct. If it falls below that, then there's a recession. And we can see, the sort of fluctuations, lots of irregular fluctuations. Here's the so-called Great Depression. I say scale, but not quite what's gone wrong there. This should be like -10. Here's the Great Depression of the 1930s, when output started to fall in 1930, went down and down and down and down, and didn't start to recover until 1934. Here's the Second World War, when obviously there's a massive increase in output, as the economy is working at absolute flat capacity. And technically, the decoupling from that into a peacetime economy, there's a fall in output. That just means people stop working 80 hours a week, and start to work a more conventional working week. So we've got to be careful with this sort of data. So convention, we might, in terms of the data I'm going to present, I'm going to leave out the immediate aftermaths of world wars, because in the in the Allied economies, there's a transition to peacetime economy. In the defeated economies, we've either had atomic bombs dropped on all the Red Armies run over them, so their output falls 50%. So we can regard those as unusual situations, not normally part of the business cycle. So we can leave those out. Now, I was giving a talk, this actually in Los Alamos about 3 years ago. I showed this chart, and some people said, "Oh well, this shows that our fluctuations aren't as dramatic as they used to be." Then, of course, we then had, and other physicists there said, "Well, no, you can generate any number of series that look like this. They look as if they're stable, and then they'll start to wildly oscillate again." And the recession in America in 2009 was actually very mild compared to, our economy fell about 3.5% compared to some of the European economies where it's fallen. So this is our task, is to actually understand this series in terms of the business cycle, the ups and downs. Now, you might think immediately, well, why is it called a cycle? Because it doesn't look at all as though there's much regularity there. And that's true. Why do we talk about that? It's a piece of jargon, it's just a description, but it does have meaning. So if you look at that data, and the American economy is typical, if you look at the autocorrelation of that data, typically it's flat, it's zero. Although it might be weakly positive at lag 1. It is for the American economy, less so for other economies, where we might as well describe it as flat. So essentially we're trying to model what as an approximation might be regarded as a random series. So that's actually quite hard. And when you look at the data, you can see, just as an aside, why economic just one of the reasons, not the only one by any means, why economic forecasters have such a hard time. If the data, there's no systematic pattern in the past, it's actually quite hard to extract information from that series or related series to predict it. And following on from that, periodicity, the so-called cycle, it's poorly determined in the frequency domain. So, why do we call it a cycle? This guy called Lucas, who's very much an equilibrium economist, but very influential, and he sort of put it all together in a famous article in 1977 and said, well, we can reasonably speak of a cycle because in general, although that's aggregate output and that's made up of the output of all the firms in the economy, different industries, the different sectors tend to move together over the course of the cycle. There tend to be positive cross-correlations in the output of the different sectors. So so there's something there which is, if you like, driving. It's a general cause of a cycle. So what we don't see in a recession is like half the economy growing at 5% and half falling at 10%, which would then on average give a -1. There's a mix, there's a range, and even in recessions some sectors might grow, and even in when growth is positive some sectors might decline. But in general there's fairly strong positive cross-correlations. And think of the diverse range of industries which exist. It suggests that when a cycle is taking place, whether it's in a recession or a boom, there are some common elements across which are driving it, rather than industry-specific ones. There may well be industry-specific reasons at any point in time, of course, but there'll be common factors driving a cycle. So that's why economists call it a cycle. Let's think a bit more about recessions. We just had one coming out of it. What do they look like, those periods of negative growth? What sort of properties have they got? Now, this is a key point. I mean, it's an obvious one. There are many recessions under let's just say, capitalist economies, the Western market economies, and they are not the same. Ex post, we can always tell stories about why a particular recession occurred. and it's hard to generalise. There's actually a classic book written by some people called Burns and Mitchell, going back to 1946, an absolute classic work, which looked in great detail at all the cycles that had been in the American economy since the Civil War, since it essentially became an industrialised economy. It's a very detailed analysis. And there are some common themes, some recurring themes, but the proximate causes of fluctuations varies quite considerably from cycle to cycle. In terms of looking at monetary policy or fiscal policy or exports or whatever it might be, whatever we might think drive it, when people come to describe these things ex post in a descriptive economic historian way, there are thoughts being many different rings. So they're not the same. Each one's got its particular features. And this, I'm going to come on to this, has got implications for how we validate models, models of the cycle. So I've actually published a paper last year on this, looking at 17 Western economies of that period, from the late 19th century to 2009. And there are over 200 individual examples of recessions, that's years in which, either 1 year or successive years before it goes back to positive growth, in which output growth in an economy falls below zero. So it could be one-off, 1 year, and it bounces back. It could last several years. And each of those is an event, is a recession. So we've got over 200 examples of individual recessions. Now, one good thing is, although we've got to be careful on this, a small sample problem, so there's about 250, there's only 17 countries, the size distribution is very similar, so excluding the collapses in the defeated countries. So it does suggest it's quite important. It does suggest that, again, some generalisations we might be capable of making some generalisations of those things. In the same way that within an individual country, that individual industries, their growth rates tend to move together, suggesting some common causes. Across countries, the size of recessions is very similar. So we might reasonably aspire to some general theorising. We're saying there could well be, and there have been many examples of recessions specific to individual countries or pairs of countries, but the size distribution is saying, well, I think there are some general features leading to this. So for example, I suppose the latest example in the early 90s, not many people know this, in Sweden and Finland had a recession which was deeper, very considerably deeper, certainly in the Finnish case, than that of the 1930s. That was very specific reasons. So partly in Finland with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had been its major trading partner. So there was a specific reason, but in general the size distribution is similar. So let me, now let's look just at the size distribution here. And this is one of the things, so instead of trying to replicate any individual historical series of fluctuations, back to this point, what we might want to do is have a model which actually replicated these size distribution of recessions as a general property. So rather than take that particular series, that first one I showed with the American economy, say, or the British economy or whatever, rather than try and replicate that, the precise historical experience, you might look under that and say, what are the general properties? And I've already described a couple, flat autocorrelations, weak periodicity, and here's another property. What does the size distribution of recessions look like? Here are the ones, these are the ones which relate to collapses after the world wars, but most of these are the peacetime recessions. So it goes, people back can't see, it goes from a fall of, this is a cumulative fall from the start to when it starts to grow positive again. We could think when again, but so here's a cumulative fall. Most of them are actually quite small, but you see here's most of these experiences of some of the countries in the 1930s. That's why it's called the Great Depression. When there's cumulative falls in output in Germany, Austria, America, Canada, of the order of 30%. So just in a contemporary context, the falls this time have been of nothing compared to what actually happened in the 1930s. Now, say America fell 3 or 4%, European economies 5 or 6%. Many economies, the fall was 30% in the 1930s. So it's dramatically different. And it's completely different. It's not like the Great Depression. It's been a crisis, and there were serious problems. I'm not minimising that, but compared to the 30s, it was something and nothing. I mean, a blip. But it's quite serious because falls of output of 5 or 6% about here. So you can see in terms of the sort of frequency of these, roughly at least 2/3 or 3/4 are smaller. So it's been a big recession, but not in terms of the big. So we'd be interested in replicating the size. What does this approximate? What does distribution approximate? It's obviously just by inspection. An exponential will be a reasonable approximation to it. Actually, a variable gives a better fit, but so we're looking for a right skewed distribution like an exponential. That's one of the things we want a model to be able to replicate of recessions. It's got to be able to, if it's trying to model the fluctuations of output, we want it to be able to model some sort of right skewed distribution of recession sizes. Now, the duration of recessions, the number of consecutive years in which GDP is less than 0. See, I find this very instructive because, as you can see, most recessions are very short. 164, about 2/3 of them, end within a single year. This is using annual data, and that's in the last 30 or 40 years at various stages. The Western economies that develop quarterly data. This means more information in it, but it's a bit more frequency. So, for example, in the current recession, the American economy output started to fall in the first quarter of 2008, and by the third quarter of 2009, output was rising, so that's 18 months. Similarly for Britain, the same sort of thing happened. So most recessions are very short, and 2-year ones, but beyond that, they're unusual. There's a tail, but it's unusual to get long recessions. Actually, this one is this one here is Austria, but that's when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, and there's also disruption for a number of years, like civil strife. And this one here is Australia in the 1920s, which then was mainly caused by collapses in world commodity prices, because Australia still produced large amounts of agriculture, usually for a developed economy. And these are mainly related to the 1930s. But typically they're very short, and so they've got a capacity to bounce back, and that might give us an insight. We have some models where when you go into recession, there's something, and it's not. I mean, just as a point, from the contemporary like the political economy in the UK at the moment, we can't say that this bounce back is due to government spending or a reluctance to cut expenditure, because this data, don't forget, is taken from a period of 140 years across 17 countries when there have been completely different policy regimes in operation, completely different. And so there does seem to be a spontaneous capacity for these economies to revive, regardless of what's happening to. I'm not saying that the government expenditure makes no difference, but saying we've got such a wide sample of different times, different countries, different policy regimes, that it can still bounce back. I mean, just incidentally on that, just out of interest, if you actually look at the revival in the American economy, which is now very strong, it's not driven by public spending at all. We can look at the breakdown. Public spending is hardly increased in America. It's been driven by the corporate sector, revival of the corporate sector through investment and employing people, which is a point which should be rather missed out. But we've got to be able to replicate this sort of distribution. We're looking at, can we get a distribution of size, which is fairly short, it's exponentially odd, quasi-exponential? Can we get a distribution of duration, which looks like this? So let me think now about ABM methodology, which I've been sort of essentially going on when thinking of agent-based models. Well, first of all, there's usually a strong stochastic component to agent-based models. in general, they're not. I'm going to give an example, a couple of examples as a bit later on. They're not deterministic. So again, to emphasise, we don't try to replicate, in general, in agent-based models, we're not trying to replicate any particular historical series. The argument being, in the sense, at any point in time, as we move forward, there are several possible histories for an economy which are very contingent. And so it's not terribly interesting to be able to do that. And so what we want to do is to select some features of the overall system. I'm not just thinking of output here. Any particular system we're interested in analysing, we want some rules for its component agents, its component parts, how do they behave, how they interact, and from these interactions emerge the properties of the system overall. And we try and see it's a model when we put our agent-based rules in at the micro level and allow them to interact, whether these emerge from those rules and calibrate it on the underlying features. So we're trying to replicate system-wide key features from agent-based rules. And obviously the important point is the selection of the features that we're actually trying to replicate. That's actually quite important. We'll come on to that again when I just mentioned, talk about existing approaches in economics. So I would say, this is my view, this is not commonly accepted amongst economists, so you talk to physicists, they can see the points immediately. So aggregate output, which is an emergent property of the system, it's the result of the interactions of thousands of firms, individual firms. I would say these are the things that we ought to be able to want to be able to replicate. So it's quite a challenge. That's a feature. I would say if a model could do that, at least it's a candidate model. It doesn't mean it's true, but it's a candidate to be considered. And this is the sort of thing we want to be able to do. You can do that. That's an important step forward. There's no conventional economic model that can do this. So if you can do that, that's a big step forward, I think, on conventional economics. Let me just talk about standard approaches briefly. I mean, these are in some ways amazing. There's one approach which I used to do, which would be econometrics, which is just doing regression analysis. We have a model, we look at the component parts of GDP, and we'll try and do some fits. We'll fit planes through n-dimensional data to, quote, explain a variable. So output might be made up of spending of individuals, spending of companies, spending of the government, and like net trades. Well, we'll have equations of trying to explain these. So we might say personal spending depends upon income or interest rates or unemployment or whatever. There's a big literature on this. The Treasury's got its own econometric model. But essentially what it's doing is this approach is trying to replicate closely a particular historical experience. So not surprisingly, it doesn't generalise. What people find with these models, academics don't because they publish a paper and then move on, but people who are doing forecasting, which I used to do many years ago, you get actually genuinely new data. You know, when new estimate, you got your model, and then time moves on, and there's some new estimates which previously unseen because that time didn't exist. And these models break down much more frequently and much more spectacularly than statistical theory suggests. So they're really not very robust. But there have been some people, they're less fashionable than they used to be. But that's one approach. Can we actually just replicate a particular historical experience? I think London Business School used to have a big model. I don't think it still exists anymore, but it did for many years. Had a very large one.
Back in the days when everyone was obsessed with inflation, that was.
What's the difference on that? Now, this is what's going on in economics now, and it's barely credible. So, but we'll see what you think. It's based on equilibrium theory. That economics, essentially, economics is a theory about, this is mainstream economics, is a theory about how individual decision makers make decisions, whether it's people, firms, or whatever. As firms aggregated as an individual agent for modelling purposes, even though we know there's all sorts of things going on within the firm, we can make an approximation. So it's about how they behave, it's about how individuals behave. And they're presumed to act in a sort of so-called rational way. They have tastes and preferences. They gather all available information, and then they take what is for them an optimal decision based upon their tastes and preferences. And they look at the information they've gathered. And for a long time, there was microeconomics, and which is looking at individual behaviour, and there's a subject called macroeconomics, big, looking at the overall picture. And for many years, they were sort of disconnected. But the main thrust of economic research, standard economic research in the last 30 or 40 years, has to be to import into the macro theory equilibrium theory of the national agent theory. And this has become very fashionable. The initial one was called the real business cycle. Now there's something called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, which became very fashionable in central banks in the years immediately prior to the financial crash. So these are models in which there's an inherent tendency for the economy to revert to equilibrium, but we're not looking at non-equilibrium systems. So that's an important concept. I'll just briefly talk about essentially the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. So in these models, and this is very important, that in these models, because they have an inherent tendency to return to equilibrium, so constant growth rate, recessions are caused by external shocks, rather than the economy has a tendency to remain in equilibrium. And the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium just introduces some imperfections away from that, which makes it a bit harder to get back to equilibrium, but we've still got that tendency. So that's a key feature, that it's an equilibrium system, and recessions are only caused by external shocks. Now, a big problem is, certainly for the world as a whole, what can be an external shock? I mean, it's a bit difficult to see. Possibly it could be a volcano blowing up or something, Yeah, but external shocks are actually, quite hard. Well, I'll tell you in a minute what shocks they think drive it, okay? Well, they actually think the main feature is underlying productivity growth, which is held to be exogenously determined in some way. Right, so here's a model. Right, so in these models, a single agent is held to represent the entire economy. We don't have different firms, different people. We have one actor which is held to capable of representing the entire economy. Now, I think there's an immediate problem is that, say in a financial crisis, the behaviour of creditors and debtors may be asymmetrical. They may react differently, quite differently. And this is what the financial crisis has exposed, that if you just got one actor in your model, and the distinction between creditors and debtors becomes important, there's an immediate deficiency. Now, this agent maximises utility, takes an optimal decision given its preferences. It selects in every period from now to infinity. It makes a choice about, in every period, how much it's going to work and how much of its time it's going to spend in leisure. And that's driven by a view which on average is correct. It doesn't have to be correct in any single period. I'm not making this up, by the way. I'm not inventing this. It actually takes a view on what the productivity, the growth and efficiency of the economy, what productivity gains it's going to achieve. And if he thinks it for periods in which it believes productivity growth is going to be less than average, so it can't get in its, it doesn't get that much from working, it will take leisure, and then it will in ones when they're above average, it will work more. So it's actually allocating every period in work and leisure, and then having selected that, made that choice, because when it works it produces output, it then allocates output to consumption or investment. Now, this is the basis of economic theory models. So on this theory, Paul Krugman mentioned this about 15 years ago, the Great Depression, when there was 25% unemployment in some countries, was just a voluntary holiday. That people had decided, I'm really not making this up. This is actually true. This is what they said. This is what his model said. That the people chose not to work. They selected leisure rather than work.
What happens if the agent decides to educate them?
Well, it's not allowed to do that. I mean, well, you might think it's not an option. I mean, it's got, in a sense, its predictions between now and infinity, on average, correct. You know, so I mean, what else does it need to? I mean, it's pretty clever, pretty smart already. Actually, to be fair, I mean, what these variants, what this one does, it does try and bring in, things like that. But it's at the core of the model. This is a real business side, which is initial articulation in the 80s and 90s, and the second one's there's all sorts of ways you can bring these things in, but the principle is exactly the same. So you can see what the problems are with standard models. And interesting, you see, there's a development on this that the International Monetary Fund, which many people think is a pillar of orthodoxy, produced a report only this week looking at economic thinking in the period to the recent financial crisis, and it's very, very critical. There was a leader in the Financial Times yesterday about it. So, in a sense, I mean, there's an increasing, just a couple of minutes on this, there's an increasing realisation among some more orthodox thinkers in the economics profession that the game's up with these sorts of models. But again, sir, I mean, that can be not true because, I mean, George Soros has set up an Institute for New Economic Thinking, and they had their inaugural conference at Cambridge last April. I went along, and incredibly, there was a session on dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, in which people got and said with a straight face that the crisis was a great opportunity because it gave them more variability in the data with which to calibrate their models. It's not at all dead. There's still a bit of a struggle there.
It does, Paul, seem to me to reflect the fact that those ideas are really very dominant. I mean, it's okay to challenge them, but I think one has to accept that there are a lot of very serious people who are, in good academic institutions, who are seriously looking at particularly that topic, dynamics.
Well, no, I agree with that. I agree, but in the same way,
deal with.
Yeah, in the same way, there are lots of serious people thought the sun went round the earth, had some very good models to explain it. So I'm going to come on to either. I think we just put these to one side because we can. I think where the agent-based modelling and system dynamics have got a lot in common because we can deal with non-equilibrium situations. Because most of the time, when we simulate the models, there might be, at some point, there might well be an equilibrium solution, but we're actually interested in the process, the process of the solution over time. What does it look like over time? And there may well be in these models, this is a key feature, the fluctuations are generated within the system, is that there's an inherent feature within the system itself which causes persistent fluctuations. We can always administer external shocks, and just on there is actually going back to the previous equilibrium models, there is an empirical literature trying to identify the shocks, which is simply not successful. It's been proved very hard to identify what an external shock might be. Monetary shocks, productivity shocks, whatever. It's actually quite difficult. When we've built a model, we can apply external shocks, of course, if we think they exist, if they're plausible. But essentially in these models, the fluctuations are generated internally within the system. Economists have the jargon, they say these are endogenous cycles within the system, as opposed to being generated by exogenous shocks. So methodologically, I think these two approaches are very similar, a lot in common. So we're really starting, we're not in a sense arguing with each other on this. And there's certainly a powerful non-mainstream tradition in economics which takes this view. And here are just three names, which are considerably more famous than most of the people who write equilibrium models. Marx had an endogenous theory. He was the first economist to leave aside his political views. As an economist, he was the first one to articulate a theory of an endogenous business cycle. He was the first person to realise, because actually in the early 19th century, capitalism had just emerged, and then there was big fluctuations in output. And people thought, well, is it permanent, or is this stuff just going to disappear when there's a crash? Does it mean the system's going to disappear? And he was the first one to realise that it was a permanent feature, a permanent change in a theory. Hayek and Keynes all had essentially endogenous theory cycles. But where they differ, I think essentially the difference within systems dynamics and agent-based modelling, this is a broad generalisation, is that system dynamic models are essentially specifying a probability of transition between two different states of the world when that probability is common across all agents. So we set up, say, a susceptible, infected, recovered system of epidemics, which is a system dynamics model, a system of interconnected differential equations, and there's a probability of becoming infected, going from susceptible to becoming infected. There's a probability of transiting from being infected to being recovered. That's a parameter. And so the basic variance, then this is actually common across agents. I mean, we can start to modify that, but that's the sort of fundamental way in which this approach takes place. So the system of differential equations, we can think, am I going to move from being susceptible to infected? That probability is common across agents. Whereas with agent-based models, it allows for different probabilities of the agents to be heterogeneous, different probabilities of transition. So I think that's a distinction. But in a sense, this is really a question of saying, is this, obviously, if we can write down some equations where, if this is a reasonable assumption to make, then there might well be advantages of doing this rather than agent-based modelling. There are good reasons for doing that. So it's really just, in some ways, I think the question is, I've got another bit of point there. No, that was the point I was going to make, to say that is this this might well be often a reasonable empirical approximation, but in situations where heterogeneity of agents is important, then we should be thinking about this approach first of all, and others, there are distinct advantages of using the system dynamics approach. So, for example, Keynes, this is some macro theory long before the equilibrium models. So one of Keynes's key contributions was to talk about genuine uncertainty. So economists make a distinction between risk, which he said it was measured incorrectly in the financial crisis, we know that, but risk is essentially a situation where we've got a good idea of the probability distribution of outcomes. So making a decision, and we know roughly what the probability distribution of outcomes. This is the definition of economic risk. Uncertainty is where we haven't really got much idea even of that. We don't even know what the distribution of events might look like over the future, which is a sort of clearly a different type of world. And Keynes was long interested in this. His general theory was his sort of magnum opus of the 1936, but he'd got a long history writing up to this, and he'd written previously what was, nobody reads it now, at the time a very influential book called Crises and Probability. Keynes himself was originally a mathematician. He didn't quite get the top result of his year at Cambridge, but more or less. So he was a very good mathematician. He was very interested in probability theory and relation things. So here's just a quote, for example. Outstanding fact, extreme precariousness is the basis of knowledge. So it's a different way of thinking about the world. It's not a rational agent maximising from now to infinity, on average with making correct predictions. Extreme precariousness is the basis of our knowledge. Our estimates of a prospective yield of a new investment have to admit, estimating the yield of a railway, a copper mine, a textile factory, because it's much more industrial economy that Keynes was writing about. Now we'd say, Microsoft, Google, AOL, or whatever, amounts to little or sometimes to nothing, or even 5 years hence. So these things, agents are operating in a world, a fog of uncertainty. We really not much idea, even the cleverest person, what Keynes certainly thought he was clever, is going to happen. Now Hayek, who is not as doesn't feature as much, but he's I think probably the greatest social scientist of the 20th century, wrote very profound and original work on a whole range of things. His entire work was stressing not just this, but the inherent limits to knowledge. That he was arguing that in many human social economic systems, no matter how clever we are, there are things we can never find out. He certainly argued about inherent limits to knowledge. And his business cycle theory, this is just sort of like a summary of it. That what happens is firms and governments operate in such a complex environment They form expectations, but unlike in standard economics, they're not on average right. On the contrary, they're often proved wrong. So, I was talking to Kim about this, you might get a divergence between what you think the economy is going to grow, your plans, and what actually happens. And many people can be systematically wrong. And you believe that the interpreting the past is so hard, they're unable to learn sufficient from the past in order to avoid the same mistake in the future, because there's inherent difficulties. So the level of uncertainty is so high, let me go back on this, that even the central bank cannot learn to offset expectations by changes in monetary policy to smooth out the cycle. And that's one of the major criticisms which we've made of central banks in the lead up to the 2008-9 crisis, that they didn't tighten monetary policy to choke off the boom. And this was what Planck was writing about in the 1930s. I mean, some of this stuff is a bit obscure what he wrote, but this is essentially what he was talking about. It's actually very hard to learn, very hard to anticipate, and expectations get out of line in terms of the way. So it's a different way of thinking. Now, sentiment, I'll just go a few slides on this. So it seems to me, putting it in more modern language, a key feature of an agent-based modelling approach to cycles must take account of the fact that its sentiment might percolate across networks. Let's just think of optimism and pessimism, just simplify and think of two states of the world, optimistic or pessimistic. I form my view, I've got my private opinion, I gather information, I read the Financial Times, I talk to people, I form my private opinion, and then I see what other people are thinking, and I'm going to be influenced by that in varying degrees. And so we might get waves of sentiment moving across a network from optimism to pessimism. And it seems to me this will have to be a feature of approaches to, I've got a simple example. So let's just give an example, not directly connected to the business cycle, but an approach, an agent-based model approach. I think this is absolutely brilliant paper, Duncan Watts' Global Cascades on Random Networks. Watts was a mathematical sociologist at Columbia. He's now, I think, head of consumer research. He got some grandiose title at Yahoo. And he's paid several $1 million a year. So, and one of the reasons he wrote is that this is a really interesting paper. It's a very simple paper, but it's a very subtle one. He says, let's just think agents can be in one of two states of the world. So it could be 0 or 1. This is set up to confuse the model. So we might think of that as analogies to, say, optimistic or pessimistic. We've got gradations of this, but that's just a simple model that's got just two states of the world. It's a binary choice. I mean, it could easily be generalised to 10 states of the world. But even this model is quite subtle. And then each agent's allocated something called a threshold from a uniform random distribution. And what the threshold tells us is how persuadable is the agent to move into... And in this model, you'll move from state 0 to 1. You don't move back, but you can easily do models when you switch between. I'm just describing this as a model, as a sort of principle of agent-based models. So this tells you how persuadable a particular agent is. And if we have knowledge about this, any particular situation, we could actually make some better assumptions. Not just say in the model, we just assume it's a random distribution between 0 and 1. And so the agent switches. You connect it on a network, so you can specify the topology. An agent will be connected to a subset of the entire set of agents through the network. And then you look, if you're still in state 0, you look and see at the ones you're connected to, and see if the proportion of those to which it's connected is in state 1. If that's above your threshold, you switch, and if it's below it, you're still in state 0, you stay there. So we set the model up, everybody's in state 0. We then select a few agents at random to switch to state 1. And then what we do is see how far, if you like, this cascade in this model, see how far, what we end up with, how far the cascade goes, how many eventually end up in state 1. Once we just select a small number of agents at random. If we select them, they switch to state 1. The agents who are connected to them look at them and decide whether they're going to switch using this simple rule. So it's a very simple model, but it's got very deep properties, tells us a lot. And of course, then how far does the cascade spread? Now, this is a typical solution of the model. So, because it's stochastic, people have got different thresholds, and we're selecting seeds at random, we'll say solve the model 1,000 times to try and get all those initial conditions. And this is with a particular small world network, though the topology doesn't make the qualitative difference in general. So we've got an identical initial shock. We're choosing 20 out of the 1,000. There are actually 1,000 agents in this model as well, so we choose 20 of them. So the identical initial shock, we select 20 people who move into state 1 and see how many eventually end up moving into state 1. So most of the time the system's pretty robust to this small shock. Not many convert before you reach a situation where it's just blocked. People, they've all got thresholds above the numbers which are connected. You can't cascade any further. But very occasionally, we see, global cascades. That's his point, but different. So here we got the distribution limits. It's a very right skewed one. Most of the time, the system is robust with respect to small shocks. There not many are persuaded. Just occasionally, we get cascades approaching 1. Quite a proportion of all agents will move. Now, this is a typical agent-based model. That it's got stochastic components in general, quite simple rules, but a wide variety of outcomes is possible. Now, I think as well this is interesting because these are identical initial shocks and they're small.
Paul, could you just clarify what's varying here? The 20 you choose?
Yes, I'll take a solution.
A different 20.
You take a different 20. Or you could take the same parameters of the network and you can do it with a different network each time with the same parameters, but the results are qualitatively very similar. If I can't remember whether the network order varies across these solutions, but that's a very separate order of the distribution. As long as the parameters are the same, you've got enough agents, the structure is very similar. Now, what this is saying is we might think, this is just sketching out some ideas in a sense, we might think, here's the economy, it's constantly bombarded with small shocks, with news, with new information, which you could think of as not an external shock, but something comes along you didn't know before, a new piece of information comes along. How do I react to that? A piece of information comes along, this is just sketching something out here, rather than a fully articulated model. So a piece of information comes along, and some people decide to become pessimistic. Don't like that, become pessimistic. And then does that spread or not? Well, most of the time it doesn't. Most of the time the system contains it, it's robust. But it's also fragile in the sense that the same shock can spread globally. Now, this partly removes what we might think of as a common sense causation between the size of an event and its consequences. Now, obviously, if there's a shock and half the agents convert to be pessimistic, then there'll be a big consequence. So big shocks, big events, have big consequences still. That's not removed. But this is it for economics. You see, small events can, in principle, in human systems, have large consequences. So if we observed, this is the sort of very abstract level, we observe a catastrophic collapse in sentiment, and then we try and look back and say, what caused it? Well, you see how hard it is to do economic history. If this is one of the principles that's driving how economies actually operate, corporate sentiment or whatever, it might be very difficult to identify the event, because it could just be one thing. And think about, the build-up to the recent crisis. There's lots of information out there. Debt levels are rising. There's all sorts of, picking up there. Stearns fails, Northern Rock fails. There are all these signs, and yet nothing cascades. And then suddenly, Lehman goes, and bang, that's it. That's the one thing that really triggers the massive, in fact, almost the collapse of capitalism. That was a terrifying week. The monetary system nearly completely froze. And the Americans actually saved the world, not Gordon Brown. That's a different story. They completely jumped. They completely jumped macroeconomic theory the last 30, 40 years. They paid absolutely no references whatsoever. Because fortunately, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Bernanke, as an academic, actually specialised in the Great Depression. So he thought, Christ, what did they do wrong then? Let's try and do the opposite. So essentially, and he took a number of purely administrative measures. There's a big argument about the troubled asset relief program. That was only a secondary bit of what they did. The Americans nationalised the big mortgage providers. They essentially nationalised AIG. They guaranteed, money market funds. They took a whole series of purely administrative steps, completely outside the political process, to stabilise the situation. But anyway, that's a different story in itself. But so the principle I'm trying. So here's a very simple ABM of. This is one I did a few years ago. This is very simple. There isn't a financial sector in this. This is just a model which can generate, through changes in sentiment, it can actually replicate those key features of the cycle that I was talking about, give a good approximation. So I don't want to pretend in any way that this is in any way a complete model. It's just an illustration of what Camilla published this in Physica A in 2004. So an important point, and this won't take long, I'm just going to go through this. So time for questions. Just arithmetically ex post, the origin of most fluctuations is in the corporate sector, rather than amongst individuals, their spending decisions. Now, the decisions of the corporate sector will have knock-on effects on individuals because it might make them unemployed, so they've got less money. But by and large, personal spending by individuals, although it's important, a big chunk of the economy, tends to fluctuations not to be very great. People still want to carry on with a living standard to which they're accustomed. But companies, when they make decisions, they might run down their stock levels dramatically, or just stop investing in fixed investment, just postpone the investment program. So the arithmetic origin of most of the fluctuations in the corporate sector. So modelling that seems to be very important. And I've got a model. My model is populated by 500 firms whose size distribution is drawn from. There's essentially a sort of approximately a log size rank relationship, even amongst the top 500. So that's important. Firms have got different sizes, and in this model, firms just choose their rate of growth of output and the level of something called sentiment, which is unobservable. So I can't do econometric for it. Sorry for this. No, so each agent, this is a very simple model. Each agent sets its rate of growth of output in period T by, so XIT is the rate of growth of output of agent I, period T. And Y is sentiment, and capital Y is aggregate sentiment. So it looks at, whether it looks at the general level of optimism, pessimism across the universe of these 500 firms. This is the weighted average of the individual's views on sentiment. So an individual, small letters represent an individual agent, capitals represent the weighted sum of these agents. So it sets its rates of growth out, but just I'll just see how people are. It's quite a reasonable rule. If people are optimistic, they're going to be spending and buying, so you might as well have a high rate of growth of output. If sentiment's low, it might make sense to cut it back, the rate of growth, because you might find it difficult to sell. But the key thing here is to say there's a random error term, which is agent-specific and time-specific. And this reflects two factors. First of all, you might not know this with certainty. You just have to form a view on this. It's not published. It's not in the business surveys. You form a view, you read the Financial Times, you talk to people, and you form your view on what aggregate sentiment is, but it's unobservable. So it's a very Keynesian model, this actually. So Keynes wrote a lot about it. It's about sentiment. It's what he called animal spirits. And so you form a view. So you might not know that perfectly. You might be wrong when you take a view. But also you're not certain. Thinking back to the quote I was making earlier, you're not certain about even when you form your view, you're not certain about what the best implications are for you. If you formed a view about aggregate sentiment, what rate of growth of output should I set? In general, the higher the sentiment, the higher you will set it. But there's not a one-to-one conversion. You're not quite clear because you're facing this fog of uncertainty than what level of output you should set. So this is reflecting uncertainty about how your understanding of this and the consequences once you've formed this for that. And the sentiment of the ith agent is determined by here YIT, There's some inertia in this, that you look at your sentiment in the previous period and you continue it. Again, this is taken from a chapter in Keynes's general theory, this interpretation of it. But importantly, this is aggregate output in the previous period. There's a sort of oscillator here that if this is growing rapidly, the more rapidly that's growing, the more likely you have to start to think, this can't continue. We're in a boom, it's going. And the faster it goes, it's like a sort of pendulum, isn't it? You're going along, you think, and then it starts to, then you think, and then it starts to move back. So sentiment switches on that. You're looking and saying, it's growing. And at some point you're in a recession, it's going down and down and down and down, and people start thinking, it can't get much worse, it's got to stop, and start to change their minds. And look and see whether the aggregate output series that comes out has the features which I was describing earlier. Does it in general have a flat autocorrelation function with perhaps some mild first order autocorrelation? Does it generate weak cycles of a period of 5 or 10 years? Does it generate that distribution, the size distribution of recessions? Does it replicate the frequency of the duration of recessions? And does it also have positive cross correlations between the individual growth rates? And the answer is, yes, it does. Otherwise, I wouldn't be showing it, obviously. So you solve the model 1,000 times, say, and this model does give a good replication. It's not perfect, but it gives a pretty good replication. If you're interested, you could look at the article of the key empirical features of aggregate output noted above. So that's an illustration. They say, I'm not clever in any way, this is a perfect model, there's no financial sector. You can say all recessions are driven just by corporate sentiment. So it's a dramatic simplification, it's obviously not true, but I think it's actually a sort of process which we think about using agent-based models to think about the cycle. In fact, going back to the INET one, one of the recent grants which was given, a couple of close friends of mine, Rob Axtell at George Mason, and Boeing Farmer at Santa Fe, along with another American, who essentially got a grant from the Soros Foundation to work. They're not generalising my model. I'm not claiming that, but work on a much bigger model with similar sorts of principles lying behind it, which will have a financial sector and a consumption sector. Many agents. So we'll see how that goes. So there's perhaps some of that. So I think yes. I think what I'm trying to convey is, if you like, methodologically and intellectually, it seems to me system dynamics and agent-based modelling are very complementary. And we're looking at things from the same. We're looking at, we think cycles are within the system. Economics doesn't, and that's just a fundamental divide. So I don't see them as being. I'm obviously, as an economist, I'm interested in writing behavioural rules for agents. I can't resist that. So I'm not just comfortable with just some different. Well, I don't do it, but I'm comfortable with differentiation. Don't get me wrong. But the staff I employ, that's even better. But yeah, I don't think there's a conflict here. That's some interesting work which can be done. But remembering that, as I started off, and this is the last thing I'll say, it's a very hard problem. So if you could go away and just do it on your computer tonight, you win the Nobel Prize. So you could really crack this problem anyway. That's
fantastic. Well, let's get that debate going. And questions and stuff. Yeah.
Well, it's a very interesting and impressive model, and I like the approach very much. But I have a lot of questions, but I'll just stick to one at the moment. Some economists or economic historians say, well, as you said, these downturns fall into lots of different explanations, but there are two types of things, really. There are kind of recessions, which is the fluctuations, which I think is what you've modelled. But there's also crashes, which seem to originate more in the financial sector, plus property and booms and things, Japan 1990 and so on. A lot of those sorts of things. Would you accept that they are different sorts of things and need different kind of modelling?
Well, you see, I wouldn't be an economist if I didn't say yes and no. But
I want an economist with one hand.
Let me qualify that for you and to say, well, obviously, this model, you've got to have a financial sector. That's what but actually, in standard economics, money doesn't matter in equilibrium theory. Yes, right. Money is irrelevant. Whereas money and credit is a fundamental feature of capitalist economies. And we have to understand this. That's what Keynes and Hayek were writing about. So the financial sector is important. But you see, that chart I showed on the size distribution of recessions, earlier on, we should be trying to explain that. We want a general model. We can't say some of this and some of that. But I'm not sure that's helpful because it might be hard to, exactly pinpoint. This is a point. What actually caused it? Ex post, you might say yes. There was a financial collapse. Now, for example, you mentioned Japan. Now, in 89, 90, the Japanese share index fell from 40,000 to 8,000. Right? So it lost 80% of its value. Land prices in Tokyo fell by 90%. And so the huge amounts of debt held by Japanese to acquire these assets because the market's gone up and up and up. There was a massive financial collapse, and yet Japan had a very mild recession. And people write about, the impression in the paper is that Japan's had a terrible 20 years. Well, no, actually not at all. Has anybody been there? It's a very, very prosperous Western economy. And it's just in the last 20 years, its average annual growth rate has been just under 2%, which isn't brilliant, considering that from 1950 to 1980 it grew at like 7%. So it's just not growing as fast as it used to do. It's still delivering increases in living standards. It's still got problems. It's got this outstanding debt. It's not going to generate any inflation to wipe them out. So there was an example. This is why it's hard to generalise, you see. There was a stupendous financial crash in Japan, which didn't have major consequences for the real economy. Well, the economy is called the real economy, output.
Could I argue the same has happened in the current crisis as well?
Yes, and so far, we might attribute some sense to policymakers, like you say, in the current crisis, but there haven't been catastrophic falls in output like there were in the 1930s. That's what's called the Great Depression. It is singled out. It was in peacetime by far. It just seems. That is the one. If you were going to make a classification, this is just mine. That's what I would do, and say that was so different from everything else. There may have been different features, but we want to try and capture it in some way. So, yes, in general, if you can point to a real financial crash, in general, if we looked at that data, the corresponding falls in output tend to be bigger than if it's just merely, a sentiment-driven one with no financial consequence. That's true. That's important, and that's you do that in a bigger version of the model. That's one feature you would have. But it doesn't necessarily follow that a financial collapse leads to a dramatic collapse in the economy as a whole. There are counter-examples.
You have in your model an stochastic component. System dynamic will try to explain given this stochasticity system. What do you think will be the key variables that you can keep adding to a model until you reduce that to a model?
No, I think that's what you want to. I don't want to reduce stochastic component at all. No, because it's got a behavioural implication. Right, this is the point. Going back to, that quote I gave from Keynes, he's saying essentially agents are operating in a fog of uncertainty. When you take a decision to invest now, to invest in some new plant or whatever, of course you'll do your business plans, you'll form your view, but no matter how smart you are, no matter how many consultants you engage, you can be completely wrong because the future's, you can just peer a little bit for the future. It's very opaque. So there's huge uncertainty about the consequences of a decision, and any sensible agent is aware of that. So I think that's getting onto things about how do we actually model? Because in agent-based modelling, we have to think about behavioural rules for the agents. We're social scientists, so that's why we have agents and behavioural rules, rather than just doing system, a more sort of abstract representation. So I think it's got very strong behavioural foundations. So I don't want to minimise that. I think that's an inherent feature of how people take the climate in which people take decisions.
I think
I think you just let other people in because you've got a few talks. I've come with there'll be time. I'm not trying to dodge you.
By the way, we've got the whole of the coffee break to pants on Paul, and you were able to stay after coffee as well. Where we're going to kind of give some more of this. So.
I'm not know whether I was being dim, but there was a minus turn you had.
Yes, yes.
Is that actually the way people behave? Because a lot of the time when you're getting these very when the boom's going,
Yeah.
that's surely when part of the problem is that everybody just extrapolates off into the future, that growth is going to continue indefinitely, and everybody rushes in. Whereas what you're saying is it's actually having a damping effect, if I understand you right. Is that?
Yeah, but I mean, it's not. I mean, there are other things. I mean, output. If you set high
I'm
levels
just
of
wondering
output.
why you did that. Why
Oh,
you
right.
have that? What happens if you turn that to a plus?
Well, then the system will just explode. You can't replicate. Now, there's. I mean, I didn't get a chance to go into it, but there's. Keynes never actually, despite the fact he's seen as a major he never actually articulated a formal model of the business cycle. And this is getting a bit esoteric here, but chapter 22, because we had to read it at Cambridge. We don't anymore. You're not allowed to read Keynes now. You have to do game theory. But chapter 22 is called his series Notes on the Trade Cycle, and he's got the first page is essentially a long paragraph. It's very elegantly written, and it took me 30 years to realise he was describing an oscillator of the form that I've written down there. That's why I mean. But there are reasons why I've written, because he actually writes about sentiments. It starts to pick up and it's reviving, it's going fast, and then the more it goes, the more likely it is to swing back. I mean, that's essentially that's abuse. It's a deliberate point. Now you could say, well, people don't behave like this. Well, it's interesting. So I'm saying here, I'm postulating behavioural rules. This is how agents set outputs. This is how they form sentiment. And these behavioural rules, around calibrate the parameters, replicate these aggregate features. Now, there may be a large set of agent rules which will do that, but these are hard to find. They're not. You can't just write down any set of rules. So all I'm saying that this would be a candidate set. It's very naive, simple set. And so, well, here's a basis which I think establishes the principle that sentiment. If we just think about sentiment, that will give us a good. That's a key part of the model. Obviously, it can then be generalised. The real rules, once you've got a financial sector and so forth, might look different. But that's the basic principle.
Yeah.
What does the agent-based approach give you that cellular automaton?
Well, I think a seller automatically, you could think that's an agent, isn't it? Agents take decisions. It's here's a cell, that's an agent. So, I mean, they've really rather, not saying fall into disuse, but I mean, people would now normally, certainly in social sciences, refer to agent-based models rather than cellular automata. So we can write down different rules, and it may be, we're not just looking at our immediate neighbours. We can specify different types of topology on which agents are connected.
For the rest of us, could you explain the difference?
Cellular automata, but my distinction would be that in cellular automata you basically have a two-dimensional, three-dimensional array. You have a neighbourhood rule, so you have I would say the difference between the two is that an agent is mobile in an environment and has encapsulated rules, whereas in a cellular automata you're basically passing a rule, whereas with agents they can decide whether they want to interact or not.
Yes, so I mean there are many similarities. So I mean, there's a famous model by a guy called Schelling, who's done exceptionally original work on a whole range of things. He actually finally got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2005 when he was 84, and he complained bitterly that he'd left it too late. He wanted to get it earlier. But he's got a very famous model of residential segregation. It goes back 40 years, and there's absolutely very simple, explaining how we can observe at the aggregate level marked racial segregation in residential patterns when the preferences of individuals are very weak. And you could think of that more as a sort of cellular automation, but people now think of it as an agent-based model. I mean, in a sense, it's just, I mean, a lot of this is semantics. I mean, a cellular automation is an agent-based model. The agents have got rules for how they behave and how they connect. So, I mean, I think a lot of it is just purely semantics. And certainly, say, 15 years ago, when Kaufman, that cellular automata, with a main thing. But I'm just saying it's just description. I think this has just taken over the description. It's not altering the content because the Schelling model is now referred to as an agent-based model. the counting stuff are essentially agent-based models. So I don't really see it different because you're specifying rules for individual agents, who they connect to, what they do, how they transmit it across the network, how they're connected.
Can I ask you to make a comment on top-down versus bottom-up modelling? There's quite a distinction there. System dynamics is distinct in the way that it tends to take an aggregate view of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is that in many problems this will be, I would see that as a simple, it's when we can aggregate and say, as an approximation, the rules for moving between different states of the world can be reasonably, we can reasonably assume that all agents have the same probability of transition, the same sort of rule. And then you can actually write it as an aggregate relationship. But if you think that agents differ substantially, that might be a key feature of any given situation, then I would think that an agent-based model allows for that. So I mean, I think it's that rather than implicitly. I'm saying that systems like the models of infection in epidemiology. People rewrite them either as differential equation systems, or there are agent-based model versions which try and capture a bit more heterogeneity amongst agents. But at that level, the differential equations seem by and large to do the trick. You may not need, except in particular circumstances, to build an agent-based model because of the
I'm conscious of the time and keeping people from their coffee. So if Paul will give us permission to pax on him over coffee, feel free to do so. And so can I just ask us all to give Paul at least an interim round of applause of thanks.